This is Beyond the Big Screen Podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen. A huge thanks goes out to our many-time contributor, Erik Fogg of the Reconsider Podcast. Links to learn more about Erik and Reconsider can be found at reconsidermedia.org. There's two great ways to support Beyond the Big Screen. One is by setting up a financial contribution to us at patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen. There's many great benefits and you help keep this show sustainable for a long time in the future. You can also help others learn about the podcast and help me learn about what you think about the podcast by leaving those Apple Podcast reviews. Now, we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. You can learn more about the Parthenon Podcast Network and great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast by going over to parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies by going over to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found in the show notes, and I thank you again for joining me Beyond the Big Screen. I don't know about you, Erik, but I feel the need for speed.
Woo!
Oh, yes. You know what we're talking about today? We're going to talk about the 1986 classic. Yes, pure 100% classic, Top Gun. We've got a lot to talk about this movie. Now, Erik, you are the one who suggested it. I was shocked, I'll admit it, but really? I instantly knew it was perfect. It kind of came out of nowhere. It's a little different than what we've normally done.
Yeah, I guess it's not a gritty sci-fi movie about dystopia. It's a nostalgic. Yeah, it's totally the opposite, isn't it? It's like a nostalgic. It's a at the time it was topical, but these days it's a now 36-year-old nostalgic. Celebration of a halcyon age that maybe even never existed, but we certainly loved pretending that it was there. So yeah, I guess it is totally the opposite of what I normally do. Well, here we are.
I guess to start off in the really broad overstrokes, I'm imagining most people out here have seen Top Gun. But if you haven't, go watch Top Gun and then come listen to this. But this movie is a really testosterone-fueled, over-the-top, military, boys will be boys. I mean, in every single way, about Navy fighter pilots during the final phase of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And we go through the life of the main character played by Tom Cruise, who is Lieutenant Pete Maverick Mitchell, and his conflict of being in the Navy and trying to be the best of the best as a fighter pilot. Erik, where do you think we should start off with this one?
Good question. I mean, what I personally think is that we should sort of like set the stage for this movie, because I suspect I was born in 87. I know you were born a little bit before that, but this is a little bit of our age, right? And even though it was made, I think we want to talk about it being made during the Cold War, but during the end of the Cold War, when we knew we were winning, and what was the zeitgeist in the United States at the time? Because it's so different now. And I think our younger audience, that was born in the mid to late, if they were born in the mid to late 90s, if they kind of came of age after 9/11, it's a totally different zeitgeist. So we have a very different concept of America in the world after 9/11, and probably even more so after Iraq. And I think kind of understanding where this movie is coming from is important to understanding why it's not only so good, but so important.
Yeah, I think that little bit of age difference, I can see if you watched it at about the same age that I was, I don't know, a young kid when this came out. Yeah. And I think it was, America kind of feeling confident in itself again. We hadn't had the Gulf War, just to contextualize that. That wouldn't be until 1991. But there was a long time where we didn't know, is this going to end up as a nuclear holocaust, and like you said, by 86, we're feeling like we pretty much got this. Yeah. And we were definitely on top. And I think if you had watched it probably at about the same age as me, a little bit later in the 90s, we're still feeling pretty good. We had won that Cold War. So we're on top.
Exactly. Yeah. I watched it. I was really just, I think I remember seeing my dad cry a little bit when the Berlin Wall came down. So I kind of came to awareness just a little bit after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so Top Gun felt very, very very right on at the time that, the United States is at the peak of its power. And, we're doing operations in the Indian Ocean. Why? Because it doesn't matter why. Right. And there are MiGs there and they're messing with us. Why? It doesn't matter why. Right. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about it is I think these days we're actually much more cognizant of, the geopolitics and our place in the world. And why are we messing around over here? We ask those questions. And in Top Gun, it was clear you didn't need to ask those questions. Right. You just kind of trusted that the United States is playing world police, that we were checking the communists on all fronts. Sorry. No, I want to say the Soviets, because it's not just that they were communists, it's that they were bad guys, right? They were the Soviets. They were actually bad. And, and so we were checking them on all fronts. So, of course, we had the right to be everywhere and to be opposing them everywhere we could. And, of course, the Soviets were going to mess with us. Why? I don't know, because they're the Soviets and they're bad. And, that's really all we knew that's really all we knew about the political nature of the conflict in this movie is that they're probably kind of Soviet, although the nation of the enemy fighter pilots is not even identified. So that's really interesting. And I think the other thing that I think sets some of the stage for us is, of course, there's this sense that we're kind of economically at our peak. And so, you've got this flight instructor who has a really nice house in San Diego, and probably wouldn't be able to afford that now. You have, and you have you have these young guys who are they're all in super good shape and everyone's beautiful. And, it's sort of this dream, that feels plausible if you're cool enough. And, and again, looking back now, it seems a little bit unrealistic. And it is cheesy. A lot of the dialogue is very cheesy, but I think some of our younger listeners would see this movie as unrealistic in a way that you and I didn't when we were younger.
The movie also, just to talk a little bit more about the meta zeitgeist, I saw a little factoid that this was one of the first films, maybe the first film that was really produced to go straight to VHS after its theatrical run was over, and that it was, I think it was one of the first films that you could buy really inexpensively. Most of them, if you wanted to buy the VHS for a movie, it was $100-$200 because they wanted them bought by Blockbuster. Well, our younger audiences aren't going to understand anything we're talking about. Yeah, Blockbuster, VHS. But so it was one of the very first films that was people got in their hands at home. I must have watched this movie 100 times when it came out, because we bought it and we played the video games. This was one of the first movies that had popular video games from them, NES video games. I mean, it became the absolute zeitgeist of that time. Americans loved Top Gun. And I think some of us still do. And actually, I think the last context setting I want to make before we talk about it is, why did I pick Top Gun for us to talk about? She's going to hate that I'm mentioning this, but my fiance had not seen Top Gun. And when I found this out, I was like, we're fixing this now, now, sit down. And so we went and watched it. And I remembered how good it felt. Now, it's also, one of the things we always have to be careful about is that it is a common thing that things are always better back in the day to everybody. And it was because,
you were a kid and you weren't aware of all of like the strife and pain and stuff in the world, things were very simple for you. And so it's certainly a movie about a time that I felt really good, but it's very much a movie about a time where I believed that the country felt very good. And I kind of miss that. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about how I think like the decline of America's character, or at least us becoming like cynical. I don't want to talk too much about that, but I do want to be clear that I think it's actually, my love of Top Gun is actually attached to my love of sci-fi dystopia. I think because I have this like sense that I think a lot of people have, that like the future has the risk of being very bleak, like technologically advanced, but bleak, especially with, kind of like climate anxiety that people have and stuff like that. And so I think I kind of indulge that feeling by, using bleak sci-fi or gritty, dark sci-fi. But I didn't really think about how, if I think of the past, I look for this more glory, this like glorious, good versus evil kind of. It's like one of the reasons I love Return of the King so much, the Battle of Pelennor Hill, good versus evil, sacrifice, all that good stuff. Similar thing going on in Top Gun, where you have, Maverick is Gondor. Sorry, not Gondor. Rohan. Like Maverick is Rohan, and poor Iceman is Gondor, and they're like fighting off, literally a horde of six MiGs at the end, and Maverick has to like come in as the cavalry and bail them out. Like very, very similar story there that I really love. And it's those elements that make this so attractive. And they create space that like good versus evil feel good ism, I think, creates space for us to actually see a main character who is at first quite unlikable develop. And maybe that's where we can get into our main man here, Pete Maverick Mitchell.
That's what I agree with you on, that it does relate to the sci-fi that we're talking about, because sci-fi, when it's at its very best, it's an excellent story that makes you think further. And I think that I really did try to watch it this time, as hard as it was to like not just scream at and be totally amped up at fighter pilots and dogfights. Yeah. And I tried to look at the story, and there really is a complex story to this movie. And you could take that, like you said, with Gondor and with Lord of the Rings, you could take this and plug this into any other setting, and the core of the story would work.
Totally. Yes. 100%. Yeah, it's the fighter, and the thing about the fighter jockeys is that they're basically modern knights, right? Like grunt troops, right? They're part of a unit that has to be super well organized, and it's less about individual heroism. It's more about the unit. We see stuff in World War II movies about individual heroism, and even more modern ones, but it's just like very operational, very tactical, very like stay organized, stick to the plan, thing. Whereas like with dogfighting, right, you get this chaos up in the air where the individual actor makes a lot of decisions. They're surrounded by, they're again, like the knights of yore, they're highly trained. We spend a lot of money on their equipment, their weapons, and they're there to really make the difference in battle. If you think of a wider battle, the Air Force really makes a big difference. They are knights, and they're the big expensive guys who turn the tide of battle and are taught. They go to Top Gun. They go to this school to be the best pilots, the best individual pilots, because this individual dogfighting capacity can make such a difference. They even mention at the beginning of their time in Miramar that at the school, that during Vietnam, our kill ratio fell from 12-1 to 3-1 because we basically stopped dogfighting. We started depending on missiles, and we would just fly the plane straight, and it was very easy to be taken out. And so we realized maneuvering is really important. We formed the Top Gun school, and other like training for our fighter pilots, and our kill ratio moved up to 12-1 again. And so it was a very clear exposition that the individual talent of these guys really, really super matters. And so you have a bunch of guys who are really well trained, very arrogant, running around with the most expensive equipment that an individual gets in the world. And at the beginning, they all run around acting like that. And one of the ways, and like a couple of the ways that we see Maverick, who's probably like the most arrogant of them all, even though he's really good, like after he we see a couple angles of Maverick early on. One, we see him break the rules to guide in Cougar, who's like freaked out from his interaction with the MiGs. Maverick does this like ridiculous upside down foreign relations move where he flips off the MiGs and just like basically asserts dominance, shows them that the MiGs are outclassed, and they buzz off. Cougar freaks out. Maverick has to guide him home, even though he's very low on fuel. It was a very, it was against the rules. He was explicitly told not to. The rear admiral goes, "God damn it, Maverick." And then when he gets back, he goes, "You don't own that plane, the taxpayers do." Right. But you're like, no, but Maverick did the right thing. But then we also see, so Maverick thinks the rules don't apply to him. But then what we also see him do early on is one, he tries to pick up, I forget her name, I'm sorry, our flight instructor, at a bar in a really crude way. And two, he buzzes the tower when he's explicitly told not to, right? The pattern is full. That's a safety thing. That is a 100% safety thing. And he ignores it to buzz the tower just to mess with people. And so we start to realize that this guy thinks he's invincible. He thinks the rules don't apply to him. He thinks he can do anything he wants because he's one of those talented knight figures. And it's part of the moment we start to realize, like, maybe this guy isn't perfect.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I think that really gets to who Maverick is, because Maverick, especially at the very beginning, we just get this aura that he is perfection. But then as the movie progresses, I think that it reveals or kind of unravels that idea that we get of Maverick, and that Maverick probably has of himself, that Maverick is not perfect. And maybe a lot of that is that he buzzing the tower and breaking these rules. There was another time where he broke a fundamental safety rule when they were having a mock dog fight, where he follows Jester, one of the instructors, under 10,000 feet. And 10,000 feet, they were not supposed to engage under there because it was dangerous. That was a rule a safety rule they had established. And Maverick breaks that rule and gets in a ton of trouble for it. I think you start to figure out that it's all because he is not confident in himself, that it does come from a certain amount of a lack of self-esteem or a lack of trust in himself.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think like, what we realize about Maverick is he defines himself by how others view him. He defines himself in competitive in competitive terms. His sense of self-esteem is based very much on where he ranks compared to others. And that's a very unhealthy, immature thing. It's a source of a lot of the kind of masculinity that gets toxic. He's full of it, right? The guy is toxic. He's 100% toxic. He's going to take Goose down with him. And Goose, his like best buddy, is really upset about this. Even though he's his best buddy and he's sticking with him, he's really upset about Maverick's behavior. Iceman, who's also cocky, right? Don't get me wrong. And like, he kind of almost seems like in a lot of other 80s movies, like the big blonde guy is kind of like the bully, kind of the bad guy that you need to like overcome or dominate or just like turn his heart in some way. But Iceman turns out to be right. Like Iceman turns out to be the good guy in the end. And it's Maverick who has to change. And so when Iceman is basically like giving Maverick a hard time in the locker room, it's actually turning on its head a common 70s and 80s trope where the jock is, you have like the jock intimidating someone else. And like, you have to, think of like Marty McFly and, oh my God, what's his name?
Biff.
Biff. Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing where you've got the big dumb blonde guy who like doesn't believe in the main character, but then at the end is either like defeated or just kind of like comes around and starts clapping for him. And in the end, at the end of this movie, it's not that Iceman comes around, it's that Maverick comes around. And Maverick starts to realize that even though he is a hotshot fighter pilot, what the person he wants to be isn't the best at all costs that everyone that everyone identifies as the best, whether they like him or not. What he realized, the person he wants to be is a team player who cares about his colleagues and cares about his squadron more than his own glory. And that humbling of Maverick throughout this story is really is the interesting arc. And I think we don't get that often. Like we see a lot of stories of heroes where they are not sure, like early on, they don't have what it takes, right? They've got to go, then they've got to find a way to believe in themselves, to go pull the sword from the stone. And so they have to like build their confidence, but Maverick actually has to build humility, and in a way build confidence, right? Because again, he underneath all his bravado, he's not confident. But he actually, he doesn't end up building confidence by demonstrating his ability. He ends up building resolve by understanding what's important to him and understanding what matters in life. And that, of course, happens ultimately when Goose tragically dies in something where it's not Maverick's fault, but Maverick and the entire Navy have to question whether it is Maverick's fault. And this happens right after he's told multiple times that he's dangerous and that he's reckless. And so all that forces him to really question who he is and what matters to him. And then he finally becomes like the person we knew he could be the whole time. And I think it's a delightful turning on its head of the usual hero's journey.
Yeah, those are the two inversions that they do. And I think the young me did not pick up on it. I fell for the trope that Iceman is the bad 80s blonde bully guy.
Yeah.
But watching it this time, you're absolutely right. Iceman he's not wrong. He's not the bad guy. The things that he's calling out Maverick for, he's 100% right.
Yeah.
And he knows it. And I think that obviously Maverick, his ego can't allow him to know it. And it's not until Goose dies in that accident that, as you said, and as the movie really makes clear, it was not in any way Maverick's fault. It was a pure accident. But that questioning, that was really his psychological and his spiritual break. Yeah. And that, the whole, a good chunk of the movie is really just playing out. Is he able to play and work past that? Because it broke Cougar in the beginning.
Yep. Exactly.
And so they play off that as well. Is it going to break? I mean, we obviously all know it's not going to break Maverick and it's not going to break Tom Cruise, but that's in any normal circumstance, somebody could potentially not get past that.
Exactly. Yeah. He has to walk through, you can find all sorts of allegories for this, just not in hero movies. He has to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, quite literally, right? He has to realize that he is mortal, because he's been acting like he's invincible. He's invincible, physically. All right. He's pushing his plane to do stuff it shouldn't do. That's dangerous. He's invincible sort of politically, right? He does stuff that is against the rules that he thinks he can get away with. And it's when he has to realize that he's mortal, that life is fleeting, and that like the people he loves won't just stick around, and either put up with his BS or literally survive it. And I think it's actually a really important point. It's really important, I think, that the fact that Goose died was an accident, because it would have been a little too on the nose had it been Maverick's fault. What it allows us to do, what allows the fact that it's not his fault creates space for him to come to the conclusion on his own that his unsafe behavior is no longer part of who he wants to be. And at that transformation at the end, he like, you know what, how does the movie kind of end? Well, he gets second place in part because he doesn't have he loses his courage, he loses his nerve, and he has to get it back. So he has to go through that. And so he's not able to score well enough to keep up with Iceman. But then he has to go to that ceremony and see Iceman win and be okay with that and realize that the thing he wants to do is be a fighter pilot and kind of sort of do what's right. And then he has to, when in the air, he has to decide, he's starting to freak out like Cougar did. And he has to decide that the people, the other people in his life are the really important thing, really important motivator for him, and go back in there and take those risks together. And you see in sort of cheesy ways that he mixes what he's already really good at and what he learned. And again, it's a little cheesy, but it's still great. So for example, he's in there and he goes, I will not leave my wingman. Even though Merlin's like, we're in trouble, Mav. Like, we can't do this. He's like, I'm not leaving my wingman. And this throws back to an earlier scene at the Top Gun flight school where he does leave his wingman to go get, I think Viper. Yeah, to go get Viper, and Viper is able to dodge him, and then Jester takes out both of them. Right. And it's because he split his wingman that both of them died. So he chooses not to do that. But at the same time, he also does his signature, I'll hit the brakes and they'll fly right by move, and which gets my favorite half-second scene in the movie where Merlin is behind him. Merlin's his new wingman because they both lost, co-pilot, because they both lost their co-pilots. And and he's looking back. He's like, Mav, they're getting closer, Mav. And Mav goes, he goes, I'm slowing down. Or he said, I'm bringing him closer. And Merlin goes, you're doing what? And you can see his eyes bug out. And I love that moment because he's still got his edge, right? He's still willing to do these risky things and push his plane and live on the edge and all that stuff in order to accomplish what needs to be done rather than in order to be a show off.
A big part of the movie is reputation too. Maverick isn't just, he's carrying the baggage of his father, which I think that's an interesting aspect of the movie, is that not only do people think that Maverick is dangerous and a screwball, screwball's maybe not the right word, but he's dangerous and he's uber cocky to the point of, mission danger, is that his father had the same issue. And not only does Maverick's colleagues know that, all of the bigwigs know that as well. Viper flew with them, Jester flew with them. So he has to Maverick not only has to prove himself, he also has to prove that he's not his father.
Right. Or at least he's not who he thinks his father was, because what actually happened to his dad was classified. And part of Maverick's turnaround is, if I haven't forgotten this, so tell me if I'm wrong here, but when Viper is chilling with him, he gives him a little bit of classified information that while his dad's death was classified, I think because it was over Cambodia or something. Yeah. But it was because his dad sort of put himself at risk to save everybody else. He was the hero. And Maverick had been walking around with this albatross around the neck, thinking that his dad was, either just incompetent or inept or almost criminally, criminally shameful in his behavior. But he was actually, Viper and Jester respected him through the end. And that probably that loosening of those chains around Maverick's neck were really important.
Watching it again through a 2022 lens is the love affair and the love story with Call Sign Charlie. The only thing I could think to call it is cringe. I wonder what when you watched it with your fiance, what did she think about that? Seeing it through fresh eyes of a person in 2022.
You know what's interesting is I think she found it less cringe than I did. I also have to note that, like, you know, for me, the first 50 times I saw this movie, I was under the age of 10. And so I was always like, ew, right? And I just like, I wanted nothing to do with the love scenes. I just wanted like the awesome air combat. And so watching it this time, I think it's actually, it may be less cringe than Child Steve and Child Eric think. But at the same time, it's the part that is a little cringy is the fact that she falls for this guy, even though he's just like a little snot-nosed punk. Like everything he does around her is toxic. He's not, you know, unfortunately, like he does. I mean, at the end, everything is consensual, but he does like walk into the women's bathroom on her. He meets her clearly just trying to pick her up to you know, have a one night stand with her. And then, you know, when he is in school with her, he's again being a snot-nosed punk. And then at some point she's like, you know, they have a little fight or a little tiff, and her whole thing was she's like, well, I can't let everyone know that I'm falling absolutely in love with you. And you're like, what? Why? Like, why are you falling in love with this guy? He's a little snot-nosed brat. And that's the part that like didn't really make sense to me. And I think there's this very 80s idea that just like, as long as you're kind of masculine enough and gutsy enough, you'll win the girl. It's kind of a bummer because other than that moment, she's such a powerful female figure for a movie that's 35 years old. That's pretty cool. And you know, she's a powerful female figure. She doesn't take anyone's namby-pamby BS. She's you know, the fact that it's one of those things, it's kind of this like beautifully like post-feminist ideal where the fact that she's a woman doesn't matter, except that, oh no, because she's a female, she's like the one female in the room. Maverick goes straight after her like a hound dog, and of course she falls for him because he's irresistible and all this crap. And you're kind of like, and that's what I didn't like about it, personally.
They gave enough of the conflict that she had within herself, that she's his teacher and his instructor and his evaluator, and that she felt that was an inappropriate relationship because in every single way she's the power over him.
Right.
But then she is overpowered by his charisma and everything. It's I think that fell flat, but I don't know of a way that they really could have done that well.
I agree. And I also, here's the thing. I also happen to think that the love story is unnecessary. I think it's just a side story. And had you not had it, you would have been fine. You know, because it had it been about winning her respect rather than her love. It would have been great, right? Like at some point she'd be like, all right, Maverick, I do respect you. Fine. It would have been great. So I don't know. I kind of want to put it behind us because I think it was, well, I mean, we don't necessarily have to, but I usually just kind of like pass it over. It's a little bit like one of my favorite movies, Blade Runner. You know, it has again, the love story there is one unnecessary. Well, it's not unnecessary. No, sorry. The scene with like extremely questionable consent is not necessary, and it's very painful to watch, and it's much worse. It's a dark stain on the movie, unfortunately. But I kind of go like, well, what if we didn't have that? Like, would it still be a good movie? And I think the answer is yes. And I think Charlie, you know, had Charlie been a respect interest rather than a love interest, I think it would have been even better.
It could have been interesting, not to belabor the point too much, but I think it could have been interesting to see Charlie as a humbling experience for Maverick, that he can't win her romantically and that he has to earn her respect. Like almost if they had put her in the cockpit, not as just a ground instructor, and that he gets humbled by her. That could have been an interesting way to go about things.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, had they like put her up there, like her and Viper just kick his butt.
Yeah.
Well, it's one of the things that we can't change about the 80s, unfortunately. But yeah, I do think like besides that, it was a sort of like delightfully progressive moment. I actually see in some of your notes that Call Sign Charlie is based on a real person, Christine Fox. Can you tell me about this? Because I actually don't know.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, I just did a little looking into her, and she was some sort of expert in avionics and the aircraft industry, and they brought her on into the real Top Gun as an instructor, and she progressively rose through the ranks of the Defense Department and wound up retiring, I believe, in 2014 as Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense. She wasn't actually confirmed to that role, but at that point, she was the highest woman to have reached that rank within the Defense Department.
That's
cool. I believe there might have been somebody after that who was confirmed and everything, but I think that's the rest of the story for her. The next thing to talk about maybe is sort of you were talking about it earlier, that this was the dogfight and the joust between the two knights. And at this point in the movie, that had some truth, but it was also becoming anachronistic, that so much of the dogfighting at that point was, and they show it a little bit in the movie, where they're being given directions through air traffic control on the aircraft carrier, and their backseat co-pilot is feeding the pilot a lot of information, because by this point in the 80s, these planes are flying 800, 900 miles an hour. You can't see anything when you're fighting 120 miles away from the person. The technology is really blowing by what one human being can really handle. Yeah. And this leads us into, are these fighter pilots who like you said, we put them up as heroes, as almost demigods of human beings, are they going to be replaced by autonomous vehicles and drones that are much more expensive, or much less expensive, rather, and technologically in every way superior? Is the fact that we're getting into a point where a sergeant driving a drone in the middle of Ohio, the fact that they could shoot down Maverick flying a $1 billion aircraft, is that realistic? And does that almost change us as a society?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things, as we lean into that, one of the things I realized when I watched the movie this time was that, like, as much as the dogfighting cinematography is absolutely freaking revolutionary, right? Like, even watching it now, you're like, holy simoleons! Like, it's a 35-year-old movie where it's hard to imagine the cinematography being significantly better at any point for all these dogfight scenes. I mean, it's just awesome. The cameras attached to the planes where they're taken off from, literally attached to F-14s taking off from aircraft carriers, right, and landing on aircraft carriers, and the camera in the cockpit, and the camera on another plane looking back on the planes that are that have our characters in them and stuff like that. Just awesome stuff. But you also realize they are flying extremely slow in this movie, right? Like, they must be flying close to their slowest possible speed in order to be able to get these shots. Because the F-14 goes up to 1,500 miles an hour, right? Just like Mach 2. Now, they're not always flying at Mach 2, but they can go Mach 2. And so, even the scenes where they're like flying by each other, like, you just never see each other because you're going at least 2,000 miles an hour relative to each other. I mean, they'd be gone before your eyeballs register them. So these like kind of close up dogfights don't really make sense, because I think, like, let me actually look up live Sidewinder missile speed. Let me look at that right now. So it goes Mach 2.5, but it's got a half mile to 22 mile range. So these scenes where like the scene, for example, right before where Maverick spins out because he gets caught in Iceman's jet wash, like, being that close to another plane, like, you can do it, and you could certainly do it in like formation, but it doesn't really make sense in terms of dogfighting, because you just don't want to be there's just no reason to be in that like kind of close arc. So a little bit of the dogfighting is already unrealistic at that point. Range matters. And that's becoming more true in part because of the improvements in electronic warfare, the improvements in like, radar and other forms of signals intelligence about the sky, improvements in missiles that can go even faster and even farther and target much better. And so, part of what is already happening is that even though at the moment having a pilot in the pilot seat is a comparatively efficient way of deploying weapons near where they need to be, right? And that's the only reason to do it. The only reason to put these people in these planes is to get the weapons close to where they need to be and aim them. And so that's already changing where range matters. Like if you're going to get blown out of the sky by another pilot, you're never going to see them, right? You might see them on radar, but you will not see them. So that form of dogfighting kind of ended even by the time the movie was made. And it is of course ending even more decisively. Your point about drones is a good one, even though a sad one, that it's just too expensive. One, the West is like pretty loss averse in these kinds of wars, but two, it's just a lot cheaper and safer to put up a bunch of drones where you can launch a bunch of like fairly small, launch a number of fairly small missiles and try to overwhelm another pilot. And then you get kind of drone on drone warfare and the war gaming gets really interesting there. But yes, it's a long way of saying the age of the fighter jockey is coming to an end. In
a lot of ways, the fighter jock and the fighter aircraft, their role is a support role. They're either fighting other fighters, but it's really, and their role is air superiority. It's clearing the path for air-to-ground aircraft, which is vastly safer to have a drone doing that at low level where they can be a lot more precise in their targeting. I mean, we see targeting with drones where they can practically kill one person with a drone if they want to. It's not, you don't have to drop high level bombers dropping and devastating a whole city when they really do want to kill one or two people.
Yeah.
I mean, this is all terrible things we have to talk about, but they are considerations that are made. And in a way, the role of the fighter pilot is as sexy as it is and as heroic. And, what we really put all of that on, that it's these people are men and women now are at peak physical perfection to be able to do this. To say that they're not necessary anymore, it is sad.
It is. And I think these things come in waves. Here's why. If we think of Agincourt, Agincourt was when the British just crushed the French with longbows. So longbows just were able to put enough speed into arrows that they could pierce the armor of knights at range. And so you had all these French knights that got obliterated by longbows. And that was the end of the age of the knight, right? And in some ways that was sad. But it's just how the technology changed. So knights phased out. And the kind of like specialist warrior, right? Because what we kind of want, and this is, I think, a very human thing, as much as like violence is a terrible tendency in humans, as it's a very human thing to like want warriors that we can respect and for their talent, their skill, in defending, what's right, or in like fighting for the weak and all that stuff, rather than just this like faceless, nameless technological warfare. And those warriors will always be a thing. They'll just be different. Special operations, in an age of like in an age where like technology will allow you to like launch hypersonic missiles at things from a great distances with like exceptional precision. The fighter jockey is gone, but special operations become more and more important because the thing, you can't kill what you don't know is there. And so special operations are all about like bringing hyper talented people to places where the enemy can't see them. And so the nature of their warfare changes. But yeah, I'm sad. You know, I grew up, and part of it I think is because I grew up with Top Gun, right? And the fighter jockey was so cool, and I imagined being in that pilot seat, and I almost went to the U.S. Naval Academy. I was like that into it, but I don't have I'm too big and my eyesight sucks too much, so I would have never been a fighter pilot. But I loved it so much, and yeah, we kind of have to like let that go.
I think about the disruption that you bring up, the French getting slaughtered at Agincourt by a new technology and a new set of strategies. And it broke the whole apparatus of society that was built around these knights.
Totally.
In a lot of ways, we're going to have to live with that disruption too, because if we go that these aircraft aren't necessary anymore, that really disrupts. Well, we really don't need these aircraft carriers anymore because drones can be launched from almost anywhere. They have super long ranges because they're not carrying all the equipment to keep one or two human beings alive. They don't need any of that.
Yep. And
so then you lose these aircraft carriers that are billion and gazillion dollar investments, that whole apparatus. And there's going to be a lot of pushback against that, like there was with the Knights. And every time that a technology or a new way of doing things completely disrupts the going order of the day.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, in World War II, the battleship was the obsolete thing that the British and Japanese invested a ton of money into building. And they were like, oops. Right, they built the two biggest battleships ever built, and one guy in a plane took it out. Right?
Yeah,
and you're like, oh man, oh no, right? And it was whoever was able to bring aircraft carriers to bear faster won. And so yeah, I think we are seeing a revolution that I think the world is resisting. Like the Chinese are still investing in building aircraft carriers. They're like, oh, we'll catch up with the aircraft carrier gap at some point. Really? Just leapfrog that stuff. So it is going to be probably the next major conflict that forces the issue, even though a lot of people already know that what you want to do is change the nature. I mean, you could still use the aircraft carrier to like launch medium range, kind of drone mothership things and stuff like that. And you'll probably kind of limp your way along to the future here. But your aircraft carriers can be drone operated too. And hypersonic missiles make it dangerous to bring aircraft carriers anywhere close to enemy shores, especially if it's China or Russia or something like that. So, yes, we are seeing a revolution where the age of the fighter jockey is ending. And what's interesting about the new movie coming out, Top Gun Maverick, is while the cinematography is even cooler, from the looks of things, like they do an even better job of giving you that like really realistic sense of like G-forces and speed and stuff like that from the cockpit. I don't even know how they do it. I haven't looked it up yet. It seems a little problematic. And you have, oh my gosh, I forget the actor's name, even though I looked it up. But the rear admiral, he looks at Maverick and he says, "Your kind is an endangered species." And I heard that, I was like, oh, God, that's true.
Devastating. Yeah.
But yeah, it's totally true.
That whole idea that these aircraft carriers, I mean, people argue against the cyclical nature of history, but I don't see how you can't say that, especially if you look at military technology. The investment becomes bigger and bigger into certain systems. And then a new system comes along that can just devastate that old system. And then it starts the arms race builds up again. Like you said, with these hypersonic missiles, it could very be likely that if there was heaven forbid, a hot war between the United States and China, all of our carriers could get wiped out on day one. And that could reasonably happen because of this new technology. And then, like you said, how the Chinese have this new technology, but they still feel like to be players, they have to have aircraft carrier, the old technology. And it's almost like a knight even though the English had this longbow technology and strategies that decimated the French, you still had knights with the full gear on amongst the English, because that's what you had to do to be a player back then.
Yep. Oh yeah. Well, and in World War I, how many cavalry charges did it take for you to, because like cavalry they were the knights, the fighter jockeys at the time of that time, right? And how many cavalry charges into machine guns did it take? And it will happen again.
One thing to talk about moving on is all of their banter when they're in the cockpit. It makes for great drama. But if you start, I think that was kind of an interesting dichotomy that they set up, because during the fighter pilot scenes, they're yelling at each other, they're making jokes at each other, and a lot of times, like if you listen when you're to air traffic control, the plane could be wing cracks off, and the pilot is as cool as a cucumber when he's talking over the radio, and I thought that was it made the movie more fun. And there's a lot of elements of this movie you have to suspend your disbelief with some of the elements of this movie.
Yeah, I agree. You have to, and you also, I think, have to. What's interesting is like even I think the scenes where they get like really scared, and especially like at the end when like Maverick's talking to himself, he's like, "Talk to me, Goose," right? Stuff like that. Yeah. You're like, "Ah, come on!" Like that's not like actually what they would do. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine someone like totally zoning out like that, and reliving the past and all that. It's a very 80s thing. So yeah, I think there's definitely some cheese in. Yeah, one, like how cool a pilot can be when, like your point, their wing just falls off. They're like, okay, although they're trained to deal with that, right? Like, if you lose an engine, as commercial pilots, if they lose an engine, they're like, okay, we lost an engine, because they've done it 1,000 times. But yes, certainly the trying to get you there and like get your emotions, get you to share the emotion of these pilots. It's a very 80s thing of a like slightly less sophisticated time in cinema, where they hammed up people's emotions in order to get you to feel them, I think was what's going on.
And there's a video on YouTube of an actual the radar picture and then the cockpit audio of a dogfight at contemporary to this time period. I believe it was in 1989 between F-14s and MiG-23s.
Yeah, I listened to that too. It's tense, right?
Yeah.
It's tense and it's intense, and it's because you can simulate it all you want, but like once you're like, oh man, this is a button press away from me being blown out of the sky, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's horrifying.
What do you think for the person who is younger, they're maybe a little bit more knowledgeable about the world of international politics than we were when we watched this initially? How do you think they should approach this movie watching it?
I think, for the younger audience watching this, I think one of the things you actually have to keep in mind is that however culturally weird you think this is, you've got to remember that people in the 90s didn't think it was weird. And I think it's a great snapshot into how much the American mindset has changed. But it's also the case that these changes in mindset are temporary and not permanent, right? Because it is also the case that like the United States came out of the Vietnam War in 1975 feeling miserable about themselves, or the nation felt miserable about itself. It was stagflation. We had lost in Vietnam. We'd lost 50,000 people and untold billions of dollars fighting a war that we lost. Way worse than Afghanistan. Way worse. And a lot of people were like, well, that's the end of the American empire, right? And a lot of people were like, we lost in Vietnam. The dominoes are going to fall. The communists are going to win. People were spitting on soldiers coming back from the war. I mean, it's just terrible time. And then the 80s happened and we felt great again, right? So these things go in cycles as well. And so I think for everyone who's younger watching this, just like keep in mind that, you know, when you look at 2 points, it's easy to draw a straight line and see like, oh, it's just downhill. But it's just all just snapshots of a moment in time on this like chaotic raging river of progress in a way, where it looks like things have turned one direction. And if you extrapolate it like a straight line, it's going to keep going one way, but things can turn another way. History is not over. And so I think like that's like actually the lesson I take away from this movie is like history is not over. How we feel about the world changes quickly. Technology changes quickly. And these moments in time don't represent long-term inevitabilities or just like tides of history, especially as regards culture. So, I think maybe look at this and go like, man, maybe there is stuff to like be excited about as a nation, as a people, as a Western order, as the good guys, all that stuff. And like be open to that.